Hello, welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to my welcome to my webinar all about naturopathic beekeeping. So let me just wait for a few more people to join. And I have got, here we go, I've got my screen on. It seems like a bit of a while since I've done a webinar, so forgive me if I'm a bit not quite as smooth as I'd like to be. So welcome, welcome. So say hello if you're joining me and where you're joining me from. So I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I'm afraid I couldn't get the tech to do Instagram as well at the same time. So hopefully you found me. So write in the comments, say hello, let me know that you're here. I'm using StreamYard, so you may have to actually write in your name or give it permission to actually let me see who you are. So tell me that you're here, say hello. I can see the numbers coming up. This is really exciting. So thank you very much for joining me. And it's been really good seeing all the, I've had some lovely emails to do with the challenge. So those of you who did the challenge, well done, congratulations. And I'll be announcing the winner later on. So you'll be able to see the winner. So I think I will just make a start. So welcome. So do say hello. Right. Off we go. I love this quote. Those who know how to treat bees do not need to fear their sting. And I think for me, that just sums up naturopathic beekeeping. If you know how to treat the bees, you know that they're not going to sting you unless you've done something wrong, or if you need the healing, but that's a whole other story. So let's have a look into why I'm doing this this webinar. So I'm Paula Carnell. So if you don't know me, that's who I am. I'm Paula Carnell. And what I'd like you to do is you can write your questions or any insights and comments as we go. And at the end of the webinar, then I'll do a Q&A. So, you know, you might find that some of the questions you've got, I'll actually answer during the webinar. So if you would just write them in the comments, then I'll have a look at the end. Okay, thank you. So I believe the bees are the key to saving the planet. And it's really interesting that so many people are now drawn to be working with bees or just learning more about bees. You know, what is it that the bees have got to tell us? Why are we so eager to know more? We all feel this. What is it we need to know about bees? Why do I need to keep bees? Why do I need to eat honey? All these questions people are asking. And I believe it's because the bees are the key to saving the planet. Last week, I was actually talking to a naturopathic doctor who was telling me that in the Quran, there's actually this section which says that God, Allah, has given the wisdom, his wisdom to the bees to pass on to humans. And I loved that. So even though I had read through the chapter called The Bee in the Quran, I'd missed that little gem of wisdom. So isn't that amazing that, you know, they believe that God has given, or it's written that God has given his wisdom to the bees to share with the humans. And also the Buddhist monks in Bhutan, they believe that the highest level of reincarnation is as a bee. So there's all these connections telling us that bees are important and have this incredible spiritual link. So what I'm hopefully going to do is share with you some of the reasons why we do really need to listen to the bees and how we can work with the bees in a naturopathic way. So, you know, the question is, we want to save the bees, but is keeping bees the best way to save them and us? And that's a really key question. So what do I do? Here I am with one of my wonderful BJ Sheriff suits on. checking my bees. So I'm a naturopathic beekeeper. So here we've got a freedom hive made by the lovely Matt Somerville. And then you can also see me catching a swarm. So using a skep and then shaking the bees into the skep, and then I would be moving them into their hive. So this was actually a swarm that had come from one of the hives I was looking after. And then the freedom hive is up on the tree, so it's mimicking what the bees would live in their wild state. So not everybody realizes that bees in the wild would actually live in a tree. You know, that's what they want to be living in. So you know, it's amazing that there's so many things which appear obvious when you know how, but initially you would think that perhaps they've always lived in boxes. So what exactly is naturopathy? So naturopathy is working in alignment with nature. And that's the core thing, is if we understand about what would happen in nature and what the bees would do in a natural state, then we can work with that rather than against it, rather than going from the approach of what can I get from the bees? How much honey can I have? It's a case of looking and saying, well, what would nature do? And therefore, how can I work with the nature? We all think of people having spirit, having vitality, and we can see when people are poorly, or even when they've passed over, that they've lost that spirit, they've lost that life, that vitality. So naturopathy believes in the concept that there is a nature force, a natural force, a nature force, that is that spark of life that creates nature, creates the life force that we can sense or we feel, you know, inside us. So naturopathy is working in ways that can restore the balance so that that natural force, that nature force can grow and can thrive so that we can then carry on and do what we need to be doing in our lives. So I've got a bee team. So here we are with our suits on, but the veils off after working with some bees at the Newt, which is just down the road from here. So you can see there's me, there's Randy, who some of you have spoken with, who's from Minnesota. And then we've got Kerry, who's our Asian hornet specialist, Linda, who's the scientist amongst us, and then Joe, who's our octogenarian. He's 82. So he's got over 45 years worth of beekeeping experience. So between us, we've got sort of nearly 80 years worth of beekeeping experience. And we are all very different and we come from different aspects. However, together we're a really good bee team and we all learn a lot from each other. And of course, we all learn a lot from our bees. So every time I do a webinar, I've got people who want to go a bit deeper on the topic and get more personalized help, because obviously with bees, and if you've already got bees, there's questions that you have that can't be answered on a more general level. So I'm trying to cover as much as I can in the webinar, but this is why I've set up courses, and it's why I also work as a consultant. So if people have specific problems, you can work with me on a one-to-one basis or with my team as a group basis. So I'm going to tell you about how you can join on my course and when it starts. And I'll talk more about that towards the end of the webinar. But really what I wanted to do today was really share with you tips about naturopathic beekeeping and just give you a better understanding of why I keep bees in a naturopathic way and what I've learned and what I keep learning. So the course is actually online, so you can attend it anywhere. So it's one of the bonuses of the last couple of years. It made me actually get organized and think, right, how can I still help people? How can I reach out to people and let them know about what they need to know about beekeeping? So I've got the course online. This will be the 4th time that I will have run it. And so I really like to do it as a set course, so we all work together. So wherever you are in the world, you can actually do this course. So I've had people in America, in Africa, Australia, all over actually take part on this course. So it's, you know, the information you get is relevant and you can transfer it to wherever you are in the world. So it might be what you're looking for now, or maybe another time or never. But regardless of that, you know what I'm doing and when I'm doing it and when you're ready, you know where to find me. Now, you can actually, if you don't want to work with me personally, I've done all these free webinars, and I've also done the challenges which give you free information. If you follow my YouTube or Instagram, you'll actually get lots and lots of information about beekeeping and bees and my journey. I also have a newsletter. So I write there about bees and whatever's going on in my life. So there's plenty of ways that you can pick my brains and find out from some of the lessons I've learned on a free basis. So it's not just about selling a course or paying to be, you know, part of my my group of students or clients. So I like to share a lot of information, and I do find that when I share things, I remember them. So quite often people say, gosh, how do you remember all this stuff? And I find by teaching, it really reinforces what I've learned. And whenever I learn something new, then I want to share it. So even today, I was listening this morning to a podcast, and I've got some new exciting information about pesticides. So I will be sharing that as well in a bit. So that wasn't even planned for this webinar, but as I've learnt it and while it's fresh, I need to share it with you today. So this is a quote from Peter Neumann, who's an incredible bee professor. And he says, the biggest risk to bees is beekeepers. Now, that may really shock you, because we tend to think of bees as being, you know, cared for by the beekeepers, and that's the best way that we need to look after our bees. But it isn't. And I believe the reason it isn't is because of the practices that have been taught all about beekeeping, and it's not in the bees' best interests. And so a lot of the things that are happening to bees are as a direct result of conventional beekeeping. So I do understand that, you know, all beekeepers, they love their bees. But the thing is, as new research comes out, as we have new experiences, we do need to be open-minded and actually take the new advice, take the new discoveries, and change our practices. And where anything goes stale is when people become stuck in their ways and think that that's the only way of doing something. So there is this new movement with beekeeping in a more natural way, because we are realizing that the conventional methods have not worked or are not continuing to work as we had perhaps hoped. And we do need to look at new ways. And as we're finding out more about the consequences of some of these conventional practices, then it is even more important that we address what we can do to make things better for our bees. So, you know, we love the bees, and we do need to think, if we want to keep bees, how can we do it that we are still taking care of the bees that we love so much? You know, we all tend to think, oh, I really want to save the bees, so I want to get a beehive. But how can that really be the best thing that you're doing for your bees? When you're actually keeping bees, you're introducing 50,000 more hungry mouths that need feeding in your environment. Now, if your local solitary bees and bumblebees don't have the food already, then how is going to be introducing honeybees into the environment actually going to help with the whole situation? And it isn't. And so this whole practice of shipping bees in and moving bees around, it is so detrimental to all the other pollinators, which we're actually very dependent on. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that later on, but I'll just share a bit about why do I keep bees? Because day one on my challenge was finding out why people are interested in keeping bees. And there's all kinds of reasons. And none of them are right or wrong or better than others. But it's just interesting for us all to look deeper in ourselves and think, well, why do I want to keep bees? Is it a selfish reason? And I'd say, for most of us, me included, it is a selfish reason. We just feel we want to have bees. And it's only when you start working with bees and understanding them more that you then get a new insight and think, oh my goodness me, you know, was I really helping the bees or not? So an inspiration to me was Thomas Hardy. I'm a Dorset born girl. I live in Somerset now, but Dorset is still my heart. It's where my heart is. And as a schoolgirl, we had to learn a lot of and read a lot of the Thomas Hardy books. And the book, which then was made into a film that particularly inspired me, was Far from the Madding Crowd. And you can see here, oh, good grief, I've forgotten her name, but this beautiful actress who was very big in the 1970s, and she played Bathsheba Everdeen in the film version. I think it's been redone recently, and there's Carey Mullinger, I think she plays Bathsheba, and it is a good version. Anyway, it was this scene from the film that just planted a seed in my head that one day I would really like to be keeping bees. And it was that the white flowing linen dress, it was having the veil, it was having the straw skep, but really it was being that independent woman who was taking care of the land and working with nature. And she was collecting a swarm whilst having a discussion with somebody, and she was doing it as if it was just like hanging the washing out. And I really loved that. And so bees came to me as a bit of an accident, because I used to be an artist and I was exhibiting my paintings all around the world. And when I hit 40 years of age, I completely collapsed, and I ended up being bed and wheelchair bound with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So a couple of years in, my husband had said, you know, what can I get you for your birthday? What would you like? And I had to shift my mindset from being sad and upset about not being able to paint, because I didn't know if I would ever paint again. And I had a strong suspicion that I wouldn't be able to paint again. And so I had to try and think about what I could do. And for the first 2 years, all I could really do was meditate. So I did a lot of meditating and a lot of thinking and looking out the window and laying outside in the garden on a hammock. So I had a lot of time just doing nothing, but my body was completely broken and needed that time to heal. So year 2, I was starting to have perhaps a couple of hours a day where I could do something, you know, just get out of bed or move around a bit. So my husband made me a beehive, because I thought it'd be really nice to lay in bed and actually watch the bees in my garden. So he built me a WBC hive. He bought a flat pack from Cadden Hives in the north of England, and then made me this beautiful beehive. So again, it fitted with the Bathsheba Everdeen. You know, it was your perfect classic beehive. So here I am on my birthday with my first beehive, and I was delighted. It mystified everybody. It was like, why have you got a beehive? You haven't got bees. You know, you can't go look after the bees. But I just felt this strong urge that that was what I needed to do next. So I had the beehive. And if you read my book, A to Bees, you'll know more of the story of how the bees came into my hive, which is another fascinating tale of synchronicities. So I had the bees in the hive, and a lovely chap called Chris, who lives in our town, he actually moved some of his bees into my hive, and then he taught me beekeeping. And Chris had been keeping bees for many years, and he has a lot of hives. So he's a very professional beekeeper, and I'd actually been eating his honey for many years. So I was really honoured to have him to teach me all he knew, and he guided me through the Bee Basic exam as well. However, I probably wasn't the easiest student, because whatever he was doing or telling me to do, I was questioning. You know, I was challenging it and going, why are you doing this? And I don't understand, you know, and why would you be using smoke, and why are you feeding them sugar? And I think it was the feeding the bees sugar that was the biggest shock to me. We'd just done a harvest. We'd got 140 kilos. Oh, no, sorry, 140 pounds of honey from this one hive. And it was extraordinary. And he was shocked at how much honey we had. And we split it between us. So I was so excited. I had 70-pound jars of honey that was going to be everybody's Christmas present that year. And then the next week he came back to see the bees, and he had this big package, and he said, oh, I've got to feed the bees. And I didn't really understand what he was saying. And then he unwrapped the package, and it was sugar. It was this big block of sugar fondant, and he put it inside the hive. And I said, what on earth are you doing? Why are you giving them sugar? And he said, we've taken all their food. We've taken their honey. So we have to give them the sugar. And I was just heartbroken and gobsmacked. Because even though I was only, 3 years into being ill, I'd already learned about the importance of what we eat and about diet and nutrition. And I had stopped eating sugar because I found that sugar gave me a lot more pain and really gave me a lot more nausea as well. One of the biggest problems I had with my condition was pain and nausea. So by stopping the sugar, I wasn't feeling so nauseous. So that helped. So I was thinking, my goodness, why would we give sugar to wild animals when I know what it's doing to me as a human? So the thing was that with Western diets, with Western medicine, as well as with the beekeeping, we have this idea that food is calories, not nutrition. So we're not looking to the food for the nutrients. I mean, it's becoming more debated now about the quality of our food. But back in the early, sort of 2012, 2013, it was still a new idea. And I was often, whenever I would talk to beekeepers about this, I was told, don't be stupid. Everyone knows sugar is exactly the same as honey. And how could I prove it? I didn't know. I just felt in my gut, I felt in my intuition that it wasn't the same. And I had to find a way to actually prove to people that the bees needed their honey. I just knew they needed the honey. So years on, I've studied to be a honey sensory analyst in Bologna, and through reading loads and loads of books, I've now come to understand the difference, that honey really is different to the sugar. The sugar is just plain toxins, it's just plain fuel. But what we need is the nutrition, and honey has over 180 compounds within honey. So it's got the vitamins, it's got minerals, it's got sucrose, fructose, glucose. It has the medicinal properties that are carried from whichever plant the nectar came from. So it's really powerful stuff. But also, what I only learned recently is that when you have honey, it doesn't go to the liver to be processed, it goes straight to the brain. So it's an even more efficient fuel. And I suppose if you're still not wondering, you're still not convinced that we shouldn't be feeding bees sugar, just think about yourself or your family or your children. And if you fed them white fondant, so just like you'd put on a cake, you'd roll out and put on a cake, or white sugar syrup, if you fed them that from August to April, how healthy would they be? Or how healthy would you be? And I think that's one of the key things we need to be thinking about. So when you're keeping bees, there's all kinds of other benefits. So although having bees in my garden didn't cure me of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, it did give me other benefits. So it's that meditative state you need to be in when you're working with the bees. And then conservation. Now that is a bit more complex, because if you're buying in bees, then you're not actually helping with conservation. So it is something that is that double-edged sword. But what happens when you start caring for bees is you start becoming interested in conservation, and you start to understand the importance of biodiversity, both in what you're growing and the other insects in your environment. So it's really important that we have that mixture. And pollination, you start to realize that it's not just about the honeybees, and just how important all the different bees are. And even hoverflies, like I've got on this picture here of the daisy, I would lay in my garden and I would see all these different insects. And for a long time, I would look at these hoverflies and think they were bees, but they're not. And there's so many flies that look like bees, and there's bees that look like flies. The world is so complex. And so one of the benefits of beekeeping is being introduced into that world. And of course, I mean, the number one benefit, if you've looked after your bees, then they're going to share some amazing honey with you. And honey is a gift from the gods. So what's the difference between conventional and naturopathic beekeeping? So the conventional is really all about the honey. It's about how much honey you can take, how much honey you've got, and how to maximize your honey production. And that really is what it comes down to. To that end, what they'll be doing is using a lot of treatments, chemical treatments. There'll be queen wing clipping to stop your queens from absconding, from swarming. There could be drone culling, because humans have this idea that we know what the right balance is of male and female inside a hive. There could be a lot of disease prevention treatment. So these will be more miticides, antibiotics, just putting things that wouldn't naturally be inside a hive, putting them in there to try and maximize your honey production. And then it's the habitat. So it's putting them in boxes that suits humans, rather than thinking about the best hive for the bees. So with naturopathic, beekeeping, it's not just about the honey. More and more people now are feeling that they want to keep bees, but they're not so interested in honey. They're not thinking, oh, well, if I have one hive, I'll have so many, pounds of honey each year. It is more about other aspects. So with naturopathic beekeeping, you're not using chemicals inside the hive. You'll be using things like bee gyms. You'll be encouraging the hygienic behavior. And there's lots of different methods that we can do now to really help with the health of our bees rather than resulting to chemicals. And then the key thing is observation rather than intervention. So people often say, oh, well, if I have a hive, how much time does it take? Now, you could be thinking, oh, well, if you're natural and you're not putting chemicals, you're not opening them up every week, then it takes less time. But in actual fact, what you're doing is you're observing and you're doing careful, considered observations, which perhaps as a more conventional beekeeper, you might not be doing. So you'd be sitting by the hive watching because you're looking for the signs before you open up a hive or instead of opening up a hive. If you open up a hive, you can have a quick fix. You can see whether the queen's laying eggs. You can see whether there's brood. You can see whether there's a drone, whether there's queen cells. You can see all this stuff. But if you're watching from the outside, you can also tell what's going on in the inside, but it takes time and it takes education and knowledge to tell from what's happening outside the hive what's going on inside. But the benefit of that is that every time you open up a hive, you're reducing the core temperature of the hive. And it takes 10 days for bees to fully recover and re-establish their hive temperature after their lid has been opened and all the frames have been pulled out. 10 days. Now, with conventional beekeeping, you are taught and encouraged to open up every week through the summer. So to prevent doing that and doing that damage, you need to know about your bees and you need to spend more time watching from the outside. And some of the greatest bee books in history, I mean, The Feminine Monarchy by Reverend Charles Butler is one of the greatest books on bees. And that was all done from observations outside the hive. So it's really interesting that we've sort of got into this quick fix that you've got to open it up, have a quick check, and then you'll know everything. And it's not about that at all. So we're all about prevention rather than cure. If you can boost the immune system of your bees, if you can improve their health, they're less likely to succumb to disease. So it's a much more important way of actually working with your bees, is looking at prevention rather than cure. And we're all the same. It's simple things like dry your hair before you go outside so you don't catch a cold. It's just common sense, really, is to try and keep your bees as healthy as possible so you don't then need to result in any kind of drastic measures to return them back to health. So we're always looking at what is the natural balance. Are we supporting the vitality of our bees or are we decreasing the vitality of our bees? I love this quote from Heidi Herman, who's the founder of the Natural Beekeeping Trust. And she says, we don't want a farmer with 1 million hives, but 1 million people with one hive. And I really love that, because when you do have a hive, you do start to look at nature differently. And if you do have one hive, it is about that sustainability. You're maintaining the balance with the bees in your environment, and you're not exploiting the area or exploiting your bees. And if you care for them and if they're happy in their environment, they'll be happy to share some of their products with you. So I just love the bees. It's just, it's just one of those things that when you are working with them, you can't get enough. And the lovely thing about doing courses through the winter is it gives us our bee fix. So here's some of the stressful beekeeping practices. So things that are not so good for the bees. So there's the over manipulation. There's opening up the hive every week and fiddling around, clipping wings, crushing queen cells, all these things that perhaps if you've not been introduced to conventional beekeeping, you'd be horrified. You'd think, gosh, I had no idea this sort of thing went on. Repeated transportation. Now, honeybees are becoming more important in pollination because we have destroyed the environment and we are upsetting the natural balance of the other pollinators. And so bees, particularly in America, they're transported all the way around America for pollination. Now, there may be occasions where you've got to move a hive, and that's fine, but you shouldn't be doing it every week or every few weeks. Bees want to be settled. It takes time for them to establish where they are in their environment so that they know what the threats are, they know what the pests are, and they also know where their nectar sources are. So repeated transportation is not such a good thing for bees. It creates stress, and stress creates illness. If you take all the honey, that's not going to be any good for the bees. The bees have worked so hard to create this amazing store to get them through the winter. And if we take it all, then just imagine if just before winter someone came into your house and took all your harvest, took all your stores. You'd be devastated and very stressed out because you'd be thinking, how am I going to replace it? And the problem, particularly in the UK and in many parts around the world, is when you get to the end of the summer or the autumn, there is very little that the bees can replace their honey with. So we have the ivy flow, which sustains so many conventional colonies, but the bees don't want just one source of honey in their hive. They need that variety. Smoke. We have this lovely image of a beekeeper puffing away with their smoker in the garden. I've even got a portrait here that was done of me when I was poorly and I had started my beekeeping journey. And there is a smoker on the shelf, and we put it on the shelf for a reason. That was the artist Annie Fry who did this painting of me. And it was before I was, it was while I was still ill, I was leaning on my stick there. But I insisted that the smoker was on that shelf because I don't use it. It's this symbol of beekeeping, but it doesn't actually help the bees. So what the smoke does is it creates the fear that their hive is on fire. So that's a stress response. It's a fight or flight. So what do? They leave the beekeeper, they stop attacking the beekeeper, and they go into the hive, fill their stomachs up with honey so that then they can leave the hive and create a new home. So that's stressful. Now, the other reason for using smoke is because when you're stung by a bee, the bee releases a pheromone that smells like bananas. And so the smoke will actually mask that banana smell. So using smoke is purely for humans. It's not good for the bees. And if a beekeeper uses too much smoke, you can detect it in the honey. You can taste it in the honey. You get this burning tickle as you swallow the honey. So it's not really any good. So I talk about all different alternatives that you can do. Then the feeding the sugar. I've talked about feeding the sugar, but this is one of the most shocking things I saw when I was in Canada visiting quite a large beekeeping operation. I think they had 5,000 colonies. So, they're honey producers and excellent honey, and they care very much about their bees. But I saw these trucks outside and I said, oh gosh, is that your honey? Is that how they're transporting the honey to wherever? They said, no, that's our sugar. So I really love working with professional beekeepers and saying, right, look at your figures. How much are you spending on transporting and buying in sugar, either solid or in a syrup? You're buying in water, you're buying in sugar from other places, other parts of the world sometimes. And then what is that doing for your bees? And what's that doing for your bottom line? You're feeding them a toxin. And you're paying for it. Yet if you reduce some of your honey extraction so that the bees had more honey to feed on, would you have healthier bees? Would the bottom line be improved anyway because you're not having to buy all this sugar? So, and particularly with big beekeepers, the price that they're selling their honey for is so low, and we need to increase the value of honey. So we need to increase the perception of honey, and the beekeepers need to start making a stand and saying, right, our honey is this price because of our good practices. So chemical treatments, it's really stressful for bees, and chemicals always have an effect. Wherever you put chemicals, there's going to be an effect, and putting them inside a beehive is going to have an effect. Now, there's two things. There was something I learned today on the podcast, which I'll share in a mo. But the other thing that really shook me about using chemicals in hives is about the effect on the fertility of drones and drone production. But the thing I learned today was that there's some scientists in between New York and another university. So it's Cornell University, but they're working in partnership with somewhere else in America. And they've been trying to find ways to detox the chemicals that are found in the bees. And what they're using is some enzymes that they have to put in some kind of micro particles in sort of a package, which then goes into the bee guts. And what that does is breaks down all these organophosphates. Now, some of the organophosphates that have been killing bees has actually been from the miticides put inside hives to kill the veromite. So it's crazy. But now at least they're trying to find a way of breaking down these toxins, because you will get some bees that will die instantly, but a lot of these chemicals will have a longer term effect that can be 2, 3, 4 generations on from the first exposure. So it's really important that we don't reduce chemical treatments, we actually stop it, because we're still learning about the consequences. And some of these chemicals, even after they're banned, there's still residues in the beeswax, and there's residues in the soil, which then goes into the plants that feed the bees with the nectar. So chemical treatments, we've just got to say no. We've just got to stop now. We've done it long enough. It hasn't got rid of all the veromites. It hasn't made our bees healthy. The bees are sick and poorly, and it's about time we stood up and just said, right, we've got to look at another way. So the thymol and miticides, there were some studies that were showing that it was affecting the drone production, but also the amount of and the quality of the sperm that you're actually getting in those in the drones that come from colonies that have been treated with chemicals. So it's not a direct response, and unfortunately these chemicals are tested for safety by directly dropping the chemical on a bee in a petri dish and seeing if the bee dies or not. And if it doesn't die, it's considered safe. Or if 50% of the bees don't die, it's considered safe. So we've not been looking until now about what are the longer term consequences. So look at this gorgeous, gorgeous, healthy fat drone. I don't know if you can see my arrow there, but oh, isn't he beautiful? And we need the drones, and the bees know that they need a healthy balance of drones. And what we found in our practice looking after bees in the last couple of years, there's been more queen failures, but not due to a direct fault of the queen or the bees not producing enough queens, but it's due to the fact that the queen is mating with infertile drones. And so when she's laying her eggs, she's just producing more drones because she doesn't have the fertility from the sperm that she's collected to actually fertilize the eggs and produce the female bees. So it really is a genuine problem, and we've got to stop it now. So I'm not suggesting we all go back to this kind of beekeeping where we're, foraging and climbing around on trees. That has its place, but we need to find a way that's working more in nature. And that's where I believe the naturopathic beekeeping is that healthy middle ground. So how do we do it? How do we keep our bees sustainably without the smoke, without the sugar and the chemicals? So one of my heroes, and I'm just so pleased to have this photograph, even though it's a bit fuzzy, a bit out of focus. But Professor Tom Seeley, he's one of the world's greatest bee professors, and he's been studying bees since the 1970s. And he's been really lucky because he's had this access to this forest that Cornell University owned called Arnott Forest, which was completely isolated. So there were no managed colonies within flying distance of this forest. So he was able to study bees completely in the wild. Now, he also had managed colonies, so he's got just such a body of information and wisdom that actually shows the effects of using chemicals and how bees survive in the wild. So I really suggest that you read anything that he has done. And if you get to see him speak, or I do know now, I tried to book him to speak for this year, and he's not flying now, but he did come to the London Honey Show a few years ago, and I've been very lucky to have seen him speak on several occasions. And this was actually at Apimondia in 2019 in Canada. So absolutely lovely man, and with a wealth of knowledge. So we need to follow him. But what's particularly interesting about him is he started with conventional beekeeping, and his studies, he's a scientist, he was all interested in the chemicals and varroa treatment, and yet now he's been able to go back to all the wild colonies and found that they fared better than the colonies that have had chemicals. So by leaving bees in the wild and not doing anything, they overcame the biggest problem to hit beekeepers, which is varroa mite. So, you know, that's a lesson that we need to know. And also he says that if bees are swarming, and the drones are able to mate, then that is the sign of a healthy colony. So swarming is natural. It's not a naughty word. It's not something that bees shouldn't be doing. So he calls it Darwinian beekeeping. So it's reminding us that everything that the bees do is done for the benefit of the bees. They choose to, every decision they make is for the good of the hive, for the good of the species, for the good of the colony, which is very different to humans. Could we really say that every decision we make is for the good of humanity? So there's various hives that you can have which are less stressful. So this is a bait hive. So this is what I use to collect swarms. And it's a really good size. It's about 2/3 the size of a golden hive, which you'll see in a minute. And so it's the right size. Again, as Tom Seeley's research has shown, that a swarm, when they're looking for an ideal new home, they have measurements in mind, you know, of the size that will get them through that summer and the following winter. So it would have enough room to produce enough brood, but also collect and store enough honey to enable them to survive till the next season. So swarming, again, really important behaviour. And this is one of my colonies in my garden, swarming, that actually had 2 queens in it. And this was a second queen who was clustered on a leaf, where you've got the main swarm behind, which also had a queen in it. I hope you can hear that. So less manipulation as well. It's not opening up the hive all the time, not fiddling, not over controlling what the bees are doing, because it's a stressful occupation, fiddling with bees. And not just for the bees, it's stressful for the beekeeper as well, because the more you manipulate, the more you upset the bees, the more likely you are to be stung. So the minimal transportation, you know, having lorries with all these beehives on that are going from crop to crop, it's stressful. It's really stressful. They have to keep reorientating themselves. And also quite often what's happening when the bees are being transported for pollinating different crops, those crops have been treated with chemicals. So you have the added stress of that. And the reason bees are having to be transported to pollinate is because the environment is too toxic for the native solitary and bumblebees. So it's this catch-22. If the crops were pure and healthy and the soil was healthy, there would actually be the native pollinators, and those farmers would not be so dependent on the beekeepers bringing their bees in. So again, it's, you know, it's cause and effect. Taking only some of the honey. Now, on my course, I talk about how we actually take our honey, which might be considered a bit woo-woo, but I meditate with the bees and I ask them. And, you know, it's come out tops every time. You know, the bees, they tell us what we can have, and they'll find lots of different ways of telling us whether or not we've taken too much honey. And I first learnt this when my husband was helping me take honey from the bees in my back garden, and I'd had a feeling I could take 6 frames from the top box. And so I took 6 frames, and when I was in the kitchen and we were extracting them, and I said, oh gosh, they had loads of honey, I could have taken more. So Greg said, well, why don't you then, you know, just go back when you take these frames back for them to clean off, you could then pick up another 2 frames. And I didn't feel comfortable, but I didn't have a good reason not to. So I went back to the hive and I said, oh, I'm sorry, girls, but you've got more honey. I'm going to take a couple more frames. Now, these were the bees that when I'd taken the other frames, there was no bees on them. They were calm. We had about 50 bees come into the house. We had the kitchen windows open and they flew out and it was all fine and nobody got stung. When I took those extra 2 frames, we had about 1,000 bees come into the house. And we were just attacked. They were angry. They were banging at the windows. And I knew then I had broken my agreement. I had said, I'd asked and I'd said, and I was grateful for 6 frames. And I went back and took another 2. And that was breaking my promise. So ever since then, I've known that we need to work with our bees. And if it means intuitively, then that's fine. Because deep down, we know what's right and what's wrong. So using different things instead of smoke. So you can use a sweet almond oil. You can have clearing boards, lavender water. That's my preferred one. But interestingly, we don't drench the bees in lavender water. We tend to drench ourselves. So we'll spray our hands, our veil, our suits, so that as we approach the hive, we have this air of relaxation and calm. And so that really helps with the bees. So different types of hives. You could have a ziegler, which is, I'll go through, I'll show you some slides of the different types of hives. National, which is the most commonly used hive in the UK. Worries, top bar hives. You could actually have your freedom hives, golden hives, flow hives. I'll talk a little bit about each of those as we go through, or a skep or a sun hive. Now, there are a lot more hives, and I actually contributed to a book which was called, and I think I've got it here. Oh, here we go. Variations on a Beehive. There we go. Variations on a Beehive. And just look how thick that is. There are so many choices of beehives. And if you downloaded my top 10, that was following reading through this, for years, understanding about the different types of hives that are available, and then choosing the top 10 that I think are either best for bees or the most easily used. So the ziegler, this is basically a tree hive, and it really mimics what the bees would do in the wild. And this is a common practice in Eastern Europe. So a part of the trunk is cut away, and then you would drill a hole to one side, which would be the opening for the bees. And then you replace the bark, but actually put it back in a way that you can easily remove it. So it's like having a wall to the hive. So the bees are living inside a tree. This will be used for taking honey, but people here in the UK tend not to use that for honey so much. So this one here, this example, has actually got some fir leaves over it to sort of mask the wool that comes away. So it's a really good home. It's a way of providing a home for wild bees. What is quite good is if you have an old tree and it's already got a hollow, you can sort of adapt that hollow to make one of these kind of hives. So it's really good if you want to watch bees and observe them from the wild without having to have a beehive. And it's good for conservation because you can't put your bees in it. You're providing another home for bees that are already in the environment. So this is the most common, the national hive, which is the one on the left, and then the William Broughton Carr or WBC hive, which is like my hive on the right. So these are really designed for honey extraction, and most beekeepers and beekeeping associations will recommend the national because it's not too big, it's not too heavy, you can lift it, you can move it around, it's square, and whereas their argument against the WBC hive is that it's heavy, you've got more bits to lift. So the WBC is basically the national but with extra walls fitted on the outside. So you've got to lift these extra lifts off so that you can get to the box inside. I'm really lucky that I started with the WBC hive because I never had a problem with insulation with any of my colonies. And it was only when I started working with other hives and I realized that the thin wood that most hives are made for really does have a detrimental impact on your bees. And so my WBC hives always have more honey. They are much stronger and they're able to protect themselves much better. So insulation is key. And I have spoken before and written about Torben Schiffer's lecture at last year's honey show, National Honey Show. And it's really important information about how much forage bees need access to depending on their type of hive. So all this information I share on my course, because as I said, as I learn something, I've got to share it, otherwise I forget. So you've got the difference between minimal and maximum insulation. There can be heavy boxes. The main argument for them is that it's easy for brood inspection, so that you can lift the frames out and see how the bees are doing. So in that respect, it that is their purpose, is so that we can keep a close eye on what the bees are doing. So these are the sort of costs that you're looking at. So between 135 or 600 pounds. So you can save costs if you build your own. And obviously the National Hive is cheaper than the WBC. So then a worry hive, or the top bar. So these are good hives, particularly if you're a beginner and you're not so keen on having the honey, because it is quite difficult to get the honey out. But this is again, it's providing a home for the bees. It mimics how bees would live inside a tree. However, you've not got them high up, and there is a reason why bees like to live in trees, because it's high up off the ground. So you do need to consider that. Something I do like about the worry hives is you often get them built with windows, so you can open up the window through the winter months and just check that the bees are still in there and still alive. So that's quite good. The idea is that as your colony grows, you actually add a new box at the bottom, so the bees are drawing down. Now, if you are a solo beekeeper, that's really, really difficult, because the hives tend not to be attached to each other, and you try lifting 3 boxes full of bees, because it's going to be peak season when it's full of bees and when they're going to need an extra box. And well, it's just really, really difficult. Plus they will, when you want the boxes to come apart, they won't. They'll be stuck together with propolis. And when you want them to stay together, you'll find that they haven't stuck them down, and you'll end up with the whole thing collapsing on the floor. So I just tend to add a box on the top. Or if you're building a hive, or adding in early spring, then that's when you add the bottom boxes. So yeah, there's tricks to using those. The horizontal top bar hive, I really like the design of that. But again, you've got to be really careful on what wood it's made of, because the insulation can be really difficult for the bees to maintain. So there's not an awful lot of people who've had great success with the horizontal top bar hives in the UK. So they were designed for sort of southern hemisphere and tropical beekeeping. You don't have an inspection board, so if that's something you're looking for, then you don't get those on these. These have a solid wooden floor. But as again, I go into detail on the course about solid floors, because we have to think about pests and disease, and also things like pseudoscorpions, which are very exciting and prefer a solid floor. So you have got the minimal insulation, but some of the standard upright worry hives, if you're having them made, get a thickness of sort of 6 to 10 centimeters wood, and that's going to be best for your bees. So freedom hives, you can have them on a stand, or you can have them hanging up on a tree. So really, really great. I do love these hives because they do mimic the bee living in the wild. They're great for watching. You have a door at the bottom that you can remove, so you can look up and see inside the hive and see what's happening. So really lovely hives. They're rough on the inside, so it encourages the bees to attach propolis, which is the bee's skin. So that's really important. I've done a webinar in the past all about propolis, so do watch that. Propolis is just an amazing product, which the bees obviously know, which is why they want to produce it. But for some reason, beekeepers have made it as hard as possible for bees to produce propolis or line their hives with it. So you could add a honey super if you wanted to, because underneath that thatch roof, there is a hole that you could open, and you could have an extra super on top. So you can adapt them. But I tend to use these hives as a home for bees and a source of new colonies. So a colony will swarm from this. They're going to be really good, strong, healthy bees, and you can capture that swarm and then put them into a hive. So Golden Hive, these are made by Matt Somerville, who also makes the Freedom Hives. So his company is Be Kind Hives, amazing chap. So do have a look. He also runs log hive making workshops. So the Golden Hive, he's always adapting it, with as he gets feedback from his own bees and from people like me that use them. But again, it's one deep box, so it's really favouring how the bees like to live. It's rough on the inside, so the bees can attach their propolis. So it's a really lovely hive. But you have frames, and you have these one deep frame. Now, the frames are more or less the same size as a Langstroth hive frame. So those of you who are beekeepers or interested in this, it's a Langstroth frame, but it's round the other way. So it's portrait rather than landscape. So it's all wild comb, which I prefer anyway. But that can make extracting the frames a little bit tricky. So you've got to get your timing right, weather's got to be right, but it is doable. And again, bees I've got in Golden Hives, they absolutely thrive. And what's good about this hive is in the early spring, you'll find the cluster will be to one side, and you can he actually does divider boards. You can then split the colony quite early on in the spring, and then you can build up 2 colonies in one hive, and that works really, really well. So a really good hive and beautifully made. So Flow Hive. Now, this is a really controversial one. So it was designed by a father and son partnership, and they're in Australia. And I actually have met them both, and I went to a talk that Stu had done because I really wasn't sure how I felt about Flow Hive. I think the most important thing is to understand why they developed the Flow Hive. So Stu's son was Cedar. He was actually a farmer, and he had this land, or he bought this land, and he wanted to farm. And the government, I think, to stay on the land, he had to farm something, and he didn't want to go down the cattle route, or whatever. So he started having bees, and he found that keeping bees was not very happy for the bees. He felt it was a stressful practice, and that the bees were upset when he was trying to take the honey. So he spent, together they spent 12 years trying to think of a better way to take the honey. So they came up with the Flow Hive. They had so many different versions, and they went through so many different trials. Now, this was launched, I think, in 2012. And I was one of the people who was laying in bed, still very poorly, and a few people knew I was interested in bees. And when this was launched on Kickstarter, me and goodness knows however many millions of other people clicked buy and supported this this hive. So I ordered one from the first batch. It took about a year before it was delivered, which was fine. But what developed then was they had the biggest ever launch of anything on Kickstarter or Indiegogo, whatever it was. They did this sort of crowdfunding thing. So they earned something like 12 million Australian dollars in 20 minutes. It was astonishing. And they weren't prepared for that. And neither was anybody else. So one of the big criticisms, that when you really get down to what is it people don't like about the Flow Hive, is the fact that they earned so much money in such a short space of time. So that is one of the arguments, that, oh, they made all this money. So then the idea is, or the perception is, that they did it to make the money, and that wasn't it at all. And having that kind of success created all kinds of other problems, because instead of just having half a dozen people making them in a garage, they then had to have a workshop. They had to scale their business dramatically. They had to honor all these orders that were all around the world. So it was a huge, huge undertaking. And they have actually achieved it really, really well. So the main criticisms of it are that people would take too much honey. And yes, I agree, because it is so easy to take the honey. However, their original design was in a Langstroth hive, and Langstroth hives, the brood box is of such a size that the bees are able to store a substantial amount of honey in there. And you only take honey from the super of these hives. Plus, they're in Australia, where they have a longer nectar flow, so the bees are going to be producing honey more frequently. The other thing that is really worth noting is that Flow Hive as a company have done incredible work at educating people as beekeepers, and something they're actually proud of, which is an interesting statistic, is that a large proportion of people who bought the Flow Hives have not actually used them, which you could think, well, that's a bit of an odd thing to be proud of. But they claim it's because they've had letters from people saying that now they've learned more about bees, they don't feel worthy of keeping bees, or they don't want to put them in a beehive of any sort. So what Flow Hive have done is really educated a lot of people who otherwise would not have known anything about bees and beekeeping. They've educated them into bees. So another criticism is about the plastic, the actual plastic that's in the supers. And that was something that concerned me as well. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is that most commercial beekeepers use plastic foundation in their hives. So plastic's been used in hives for a long time. If you're worried about plastic being a single use and being thrown away, the thing about plastic is it lasts forever. So if you have plastic in a beehive, it's going to be in a beehive forever. So it's not going to be washed up on the beaches. So you have that advantage. Now, if you're worried about plastic because of beeswax and beeswax communication, that is a very valid worry, a really valid concern. Now, the whole of the super is not all plastic, and so the bees do have to line it with wax, and they do draw out wax on it. Now, wax is really important because it's the main communication method within a beehive. So the bees really need the wax, and I'll talk in a minute about the frequency of wax and why it's so important. But that communication is most important in the brood. So what the Flow Hive has is foundation-less frames in the base, in the brood box, and the plastic is only in the super mechanisms in the top super box. So in actual fact, they're not using any foundation at all in the base. So they have addressed all these things, and I think it's definitely something worth thinking of. However, I've got a Flow Hive of my own, and then I've also got clients, and I've worked with Flow Hives in Cocos Keeling, South Africa, and here in the UK. And I have to admit that in South Africa, they probably work best. And this is the thing, it has a similar climate to Australia. You've got sort of milder winters, you have got a bit of winter, but you'll have a dry season and a wet season. In Cocos Keeling Islands, they were working well in respect to the bees produce a lot of honey. And so, it wasn't affecting the bees by taking it, made it easier to take the honey. Although, funnily enough, when we were extracting honey from a Flow Hive on the Cocos Keeling Islands, we actually lifted the whole super off and then tipped it all in a bucket because there was just so many bees and so much honey. But the problem in Cocos Keeling is it's in the tropics, and so the humidity affects the wood, and so the hives don't last very long. So there they would actually use the plastic hives, Appy May hives, which I don't mention here, but I do talk about on my course, because they have a place as well, and they are completely plastic hives. Anyway, so the Flow Hive, but here in the UK, what I've found in my experience is the wood is not very thick. And although I've had colonies who've really thrived through the summer, if we've had a wet autumn or wet winter, they just can't maintain their temperatures. It really needs added insulation. So ideally you'd put it inside a WBC hive, but of course it's all the wrong dimensions. But I think that's the way forward. And the roof, you need to line the roof or cover the roof because moisture gets in if with our persistent wet weather that we get here where it's cold and damp. And if the bees aren't, if that hive isn't getting enough sunshine to dry it out, then it is a problem. And I think that's why here in Britain, you're really lucky if you can get bees to get up into the super and produce enough honey. But I think overall, it's definitely a hive worth considering, but there are lots of things to think about. And I know somebody had sent me a question about a beehive and hopefully is watching this or will be catching on the replay. So I hope that's answered some of your questions. So yeah, there's the idea of greedy beekeepers, but Flow Hive have really gone out of their way to educate everyone who has a beehive to minimize the chance of greedy beekeepers. And to be quite honest, if you're only taking honey from the super, you're doing nothing that conventional beekeepers aren't doing anyway. So, it's something to consider. So this is a lovely quote from Jonathan Powell, who's another one of the founders of the Natural Beekeeping Trust. And he's done a lot of research about frequencies of wax and bees. And bees have this frequency of 256 hertz. And what's interesting is that the bees make the wax. They make the wax from the honey. Now, the honey is coming from all different plants. So there's something that the bees do to the honey as they process it into the wax that creates this vibration, this frequency. And so the bees need this wax to actually transport or transfer communication. So when they do a waggle dance, the vibrations of that dance are carried through the wax around the hive. So it allows this sort of spontaneous, instant communication around the hive. So we know that the wax holds a memory, both, chemical, from the signals that the bees put into it. So this is, the wax is where the bee larvae grow and develop. So there's a lot more that we need to know about wax and the importance of wax. But as long as the bees have got wax comb in their brood, then that's really important. Now, I've also learned a lot more about wax moth, which I go into on the course as well, because with conventional beekeeping, you're taught to kill the wax moth, to use chemicals to get rid of them. However, in the wild, we found that bees will work with wax moths so that they can replenish old wax comb with new wax comb. So this is really exciting science that's coming out. And, again, if we want to know how to do things naturally, just see what the bees do in the wild when they don't have us helping them. So then the next hive is a skep or a sun hive. And skeps and sun hives, they've been used for thousands of years and are still used around the world today. And they are made from whatever materials you have to hand. So grasses, these are made from straw, rye straw and wheat straw. So you want to make sure that you've got a good source of straw. I do actually have a skep course. So I've been teaching people skep making for about 7 years. And so because of the last couple of years, I actually moved it onto an online course, which was fun. But we're having some success. People are getting the information they need. And as with all things, it's practice makes perfect. But one of the main things about straw is it is really well insulated. So when you weave a good skep basket, you are providing that insulation. Also, it's a rough interior, so the bees can attach the propolis. Now, people worry about the honey getting extracted, and traditionally the bees would be killed. They'd either be put in sulfur pits or drowned to take the honey from these hives. But now what you can do is you can actually make a super on the top, or you could drive the bees out and then take the honey. So there's other practices. And there's a wonderful skep beekeeper called Chris Parks. And I really recommend you look him up because he practices with a lot of skeps. He's also a great master skep maker. So, he runs courses as well that you can go on. But he actually has a lot of his colonies kept in skeps. So he's really good and interesting about the success he has and how he takes his honey. I actually have a jar of his honey from one of his skep colonies. So that's really exciting. So one of the criticisms about skeps is that you can't check for the disease because obviously you haven't got frames that you can remove. However, the sun hive does have frames. It has these round curved frames in the top basket to enable that. So you just lift off the top basket and you've got these rounded frames that you can lift out and check for bees, for any kind of bee diseases or to see how the brood is doing, should you want to be doing that. And they're handmade. And for me personally, I didn't feel I was a real beekeeper until I'd made my own skep. And skeps are really useful for when you're collecting swarms. And it's a very therapeutic, meditative practice that you can do. So, it's a really good thing to do through the winter months. So then there's where do you place your hive? You've got your garden. You have to consider your neighbours. Swarming, are you going to allow your bees to swarm? And if so, what kind of impact is that going to have on your neighbours or on your family or on your property or on the bees? Is it safe for them to swarm wherever you are? So there are people that keep bees on allotments, and that can be good, but of course you've got to consider your other allotment keepers, and you've got to be prepared for being accused of your bees stinging them, and your bees taking all the nectar from their plants. So again, it takes a bit of consideration of where to place it. You also need to look at the hedge line, because as the bees leave a hive, they come out at about 45 degrees. So if you've got them and right next to a footpath and you're going to walk along and they're going to be hitting you in the head, you're going to get stung. So definitely consider all these things about where you're going to put a hive. And there's a lot of things to consider. So I do go into this again in greater depth, and you can then even go into frequency and vibrations and geopathic stress lines and the impacts that they will have on where you place your hive. But the basic rule of thumb is that the bees like to have a little bit of sunshine early in the morning throughout the year. Also, don't put them underneath a tree where it's going to be dripping, because that's going to be irritating. And if it's a damp place, if there's a risk of flooding. So there's a lot of things that are obvious when you know how, but until you think about them, they're not. So keep an eye on, places in your garden or where you would put bees, and just have a watch at it through the year and just have a think. So this time of year, it's really great in the winter because you can see where the sun goes. And if you can get a bit of winter sun on your hives, then that's really, really beneficial for them. But they also would like to have a little bit of protection from direct sunlight in the summer. So if you've got bees on top of a roof and it's a concrete roof, then the temperature is going to really increase through the summer. So do have a think about various places. So orchards are ideal as long as they're not being drenched with chemicals. So finding your bees. Well, a swarm is obviously lovely. I do believe that the bees choose the keeper. So, and then also beekeepers choose other beekeepers. So if I meet somebody and I feel that the bees would like to be with them, then I will, if I have a spare swarm, then that's who I will give my bees to. But I do believe that if you have a hive in the right place, you place it right, the bees will come. Alternatively, it's good to network with your local beekeepers, because then you might be able to purchase a nucleus. So that's just a queen and a small cluster of bees that will then grow and expand to give you a full colony through that season. So yeah, getting a nucleus is a good way. Swarms, catching a swarm, that's obviously the ideal. So put the word out to your neighbours that if any bees come and swarm, that you'll come and collect them, and then you can bring them back and put them in your hive. And then split. So again, if you know a local beekeeper and you like the way that they're practicing with their bees, see if they will split a colony, and then you can have that split. But the main thing is to have your local bees. If you're ordering a package of bees from more than 5 miles away, you are in effect adding 50,000 more hungry mouths that need feeding in your environment. And if you don't know about what native bees you already have living in your environment, then that's going to have a detrimental impact on them. And it would be a real shame that we continue to have more and more really incredible pollinators, some of the bumblebees and the really specialized solitary bees being made extinct because people feel they want to have bees and they want to have them now. How much time does it take? I love this photograph. This is with my mentor, Chris, and this was the first swarm that I had. And I was all excited because the bees were all over the air, and it seemed like it was a big panic situation and that we needed help now. And he was very relaxed. He said, "Oh, I'll be over, in about half an hour." And then once we'd captured them in the skep and put them on the sheet, he then said, "Oh, I'll come back in a couple of hours." So it was all very relaxed. So bees really take how much time you want to take, and what are you going to do in between catching a swarm and then collecting it and rehousing it? How much time do you want to be spending sort of manipulating them? So if it's conventional, then you're meant to be opening your hive every week. So right through from April through to August, you need to be around so that you can open your hive every week. If you're not conventional, then you need to be around your hive every week so you can watch and see what's going on, so you know if they're okay and if they need any help. So it's it's how much commitment do you want to give your bees. If you've got them living in a tree and you're not doing anything with them, then you can carry on life as normal, but just be prepared around swarming time, which could be middle of April to middle of June or end of June, that you are available, because you do have this responsibility to protect everybody else from your swarms. So there we go. Feed or not to feed? Well, I've already covered about sugar and how damaging it is. And this gives you an idea of the different ingredients in honey and just how important it is. So the definition of honey is that it's a sweet substance that comes from Apis mellifera. Now, this is quite key because it's the Western honeybee, not the other species of honeybees. So this is something that needs addressing. And either from the nectar of plants or from the secretions of aphids. So your bees will feed on aphid secretions, so aphids that are feeding on honeydew. So that will also produce the honey. Now, when you look at all these different ingredients, and we know that there's 180 different compounds in honey, why would you want to give them sugar? There's just no comparison. Oh, hello, Maggie. Lovely to see you. So yeah, fondant is just sugar, just awful stuff. So planting for bees, you want to have a lovely range of wild and native species. I want you to love your dandelions because they're such an important source of nectar and pollen for the bees. And through the winter months, we're wanting pollen, we're wanting nectar, so that if it's warmer and the bees are flying, that they can then actually collect something. So snowdrops are really important, and we're starting to see the first snowdrops coming out. But the snowdrops don't produce honey because the bees collect the pollen from snowdrops. So this is why we need a variety. And if you haven't got snowdrops, you need to have something else. So it's thinking about what is going to feed your bees throughout the year. And the most important thing is not having any chemicals. So none of the nasties, no organic phosphate, none of the organophosphates, none of the systemic pesticides, none of the neonics. So you need to check when you're buying your seeds, when you're buying bulbs, when you're buying plants, when you're buying compost, that it doesn't have any of these nasties in. Because if we can feed the bees, that's the first line of improving their health. They are what they eat, and they are dependent on eating what we have available for them. So our agreement with the bees is to provide them with this nutritious environment that will enable them to be healthy. And then in turn, they can provide honey for us, which will be medicine to heal us. So there's lots of ways. If you then think, gosh, this keeping bees is a bit too heavy for me, and maybe I just want to help bees in a different way, then the number one thing is buy, eat, and grow organic food. That's just so important. This diagram here that shows the effects of of systemic pesticides and how they go into the soil and then they come up in the plant, and every part of that plant is actually toxic. And those chemicals go into the tissues of the plant. They go into the soil and then into the tissues of the next plant. So if we stop buying chemical food, that will be the number one thing to really help the bees. Something I'd like to ask you, though, is when you look at sunflowers, which were one of the first plants to use these systemic pesticides, the sunflowers were grown for us to eat the seeds and to have the oil. So if these pesticides are doing so much damage to the bees, surely they could be having an impact on our health as well. So it's not just saving the bees, it will actually be helping your own health. So we've just got to stop using chemicals. Just stop. That's it. Stop. And then educate yourselves and others. So spread the words. If you've learned anything today, then tell other people, share the wisdom. Tell them to come onto a bee safari with me. Just share the wisdom. We've got the Byzantium at the Newt, which has got loads and loads of information about bees, and the observation hives. So the Newt in Somerset, look it up and come and visit it there, because you'll see what we've been doing with me and my bee team, what we've been putting into practice. Is the whole story of naturopathic beekeeping, and it's working. We've got healthy colonies and they're thriving. So if you want to see it in action, I am a beekeeper of my word. I do practice what I'm preaching. So, and purchase power, because where you spend your money has an impact on changing the world. So if you can stop buying chemical food, if you start putting your money towards chemical-free choices with plants, with food, with anything, then that has an impact, because it is a money-led society. And if the big producers realize that you're stopping buying things that have chemicals in, then they will adapt, they will change. So we do have the power. There's only a few hundred big corporations, there's only a few hundred governments, but there's 7 billion of us. And if we all just make those choices and start choosing to have non-chemical products, that will have a huge impact on the well-being of bees and, of course, ourselves. So how can we help you? So I do the swarm collection and housing of bees. We consult for individuals, hotels, businesses, farms. I love connecting honey manufacturers with distributors and industry experts. It's a growing world of beekeepers, and bee people all have their own specialisms, and it's a great world that I love to connect people within that world to each other who wouldn't normally meet up. So that's something that we do. I am trained as a honey sensory analysis, so I love tasting honeys and sort of helping people with improving the quality of their honeys for their customers, but also judging. So I do judge for honey competitions. And then I have my online naturopathic beekeeping course. So if you are either an existing beekeeper and you want to transition to a naturopathic method, or if you're an absolute beginner and you just don't know where to start, my course is available for you. So this is what we do. We've got advice on hives, finding your bees and where to place them. So I touched on it today, but there is a lot more detail. And what we do is work through it together so that I can help you find the bees in your area and know exactly where to place the hives. I can help transition from conventional to naturopathic. You know, there's a lot of fear involved with when you stop using chemicals. What will happen? Will you lose all your bees? And also justifying your decision, because you could be getting resistance from other beekeepers who think you're doing the wrong thing. So it's really important to have that knowledge, to have that information, and to have it all to hand so that you can justify the decisions that you're making. You'll also learn about the care and management of pests and disease, because being a naturopathic beekeeper is not about just leaving them to it. You have to know about diseases, you have to know about pests, and you have to know how to improve the health of your bees so that they do not get sick. And more importantly, that they don't get sick and start spreading diseases to other beekeepers. So this is really, really important information. So we do cover all of that. And then finally, the sweet spot, how to take the honey from the hive, what other products you can get from the hive, and then a sort of a month by month description of what you should be doing with your bees and what, you know, how to go forward with what you want to do. I've made lip balm. I've actually produced it so it can be sold. And that can be a minefield if you don't know how to make your lip balm. You don't know what the recipe is. You don't know how to get a CSPR. There's all these things that once you do it, you know, I can share the information and I can make it easier for you. So I don't want beekeeping to be this stressful experience where you don't know where to go, or you feel you don't know anything. I share everything that I've learned, and my bee team share everything they've learned. I've got interviews with some great fellow beekeepers and wise people. So it's just trying to take away the stress of where to start if you want to keep bees, or where to start if you want to stop using your chemicals. So I've got some lovely testimonials from people who've gone through the course. And this one is from Mick. So he says, my knowledge and passion for bees is infectious, and coupled with engaging teaching style with a real emphasis on bee welfare, she inspires confidence to take those first steps in looking after bees. And he's also been fortunate to join me for honey tastings and even a bee safari, which he can't recommend highly enough. So thank you, Mick. And it was a delight to teach him. And interestingly, he called his colonies after a fellow student, Esther, and myself. So there's Queen Esther and Queen Paula, who are now thriving in his garden. So I did the challenge and I was going to announce the winner, and the winner is Natalia, and her Instagram tag is at Path to Develop. So she successfully completed all of the challenges and then came out of the hat first. So she took part on Instagram. So well done, Natalia. So I'll be emailing you and telling you how to get access to the course. So congratulations. And thank you very much to all of you who took part. So we did get the emails, and I loved your drawings and your maps of where you're going to put the beehives. So really great work. And hopefully the challenge has helped some of you, given you enough information to get you started on your beekeeping journey. So I am running my beekeeping course, and it opens at the beginning of February. So from now, the cart is open. So if you buy today, you will receive these extras for free. So I'm giving away access to my skep making course. So that would normally be £87. You're actually going to have signed copies of A to B's and B's in Bhutan. So I'm on the last few copies of A to B. So the second edition is almost sold out. So that's exciting. You'll also receive a Plants for Bees tea towel. So that will actually has 12 plants on it, which show you plants that will feed the bees throughout the year. So it's a really handy tea towel. And Randy tells me it's really good for wiping, working for drying glassware. So, and she loves her glassware. So it's really important to have a tea towel that works on glassware and doesn't make it smeary. So that's a really good testimonial on my tea towels. And then you'll also get the ebook of the Principles of Naturopathic Beekeeping. So this is a book that I've published, but only as an ebook as yet. And it's all about the main principles of naturopathic beekeeping. So it's quite a read, but it will also give you connections to a deeper history of naturopathy. So that will save you £128.97. So the price is £347, and that includes weekly live Zoom sessions. So I do a lesson, and then we have the questions and answers. And then for a year, I do monthly live sessions that you can join, and so you can ask questions and answers. So I run the courses through the winter months, but it's often in the summer months that you've got your questions. So we've got a really great community. It's run on a platform called Teachable, so you can access your course. You'll get access to all the replays of any of the videos, and also you'll get access to the previous recordings, because each time I do the course, it changes as I've learnt new things and as we have new questions. So you can ask questions within the course structure so that you can actually, have your questions answered. So I'm really grateful that you've watched me today and you've joined me and hopefully learned lots about beekeeping. So there's the link. I'm going to add the link in the comments, but I'm going to have to do a bit of technical stuff here. So here's a list as well of recommended books. So I recommend you take a screenshot of this. But this is also in my course. So I have a recommended reading list so that you can actually, find out more about these books. So there's the link again. So you just go to my website, paulacarnell.com, and in the shop, I've got naturopathic beekeeping. So you can do paulacarnell.com/product/naturopathic-beekeeping. And that will take you to be able to get your place on the course. So the next course starts on February the 5th. But if you buy today, you get access to it straight away. So you can actually start having a look at the initial courses, the initial classes. So there we go. And I'm going to have to put my glasses on so that I can add the link in the comments, so then you can just click on that. So do type any questions that you've got in the comments. And then what I can do is answer any questions that you've got. Right, okay, I'm trying to post that. Gosh. Right. Let me try and post that again. For some reason it doesn't want to post. There we go. I think it might have come up a couple of times now. So if you've got a question, then type it in the comments. I know I had some questions about the flow hive, but hopefully I've answered those. If you want to know anything more about the course, if you want to know how often I run it, or the dates, then just you can send me a DM or you can comment here. But I have found that by running the course together, so that each week we meet up, it helps you to complete the course. I'm probably the same as most of you, where you buy an online course and then you don't finish it because you've just got to, you need that accountability. And also, I want to stretch you. I want you to be really prepared, because keeping bees is a responsibility, and it's not a responsibility to take lightly. So it's really important that you have that support, and you don't just have me, you have the whole bee team. And so we've all got our experience. So any kind of questions you have about your hives, about your bees, anything bizarre that happens with your colonies, between us we can solve the problems and help you resolve whatever is causing problems for your bees. So I did mention about pseudoscorpions and solid floors, and that's a really interesting subject. So if you're looking at what sort of hive you want to have, we've been encouraged to have the mesh floors, so that when you use chemical treatments, you get all the vermite dropping through onto the mesh floor. Now, 50 years ago, we didn't have those. We had solid floors. And in those solid floors, you would have bits of straw and you'd have all sorts of bits of crud. But you'd also have pseudoscorpions, which are a tiny, tiny little insect, which interestingly feed off varroamite. Now, there's been research in Germany that says that we need to, looked into using pseudoscorpions instead of chemicals for varroamite. But their angle was that if we ship the pseudoscorpions to people, what happens is the pseudoscorpion is actually cannibalistic. And so if you have a package of pseudoscorpions, you're only going to receive one fat one, which then probably can't breed. So it's a case of creating the environment so they come. We know that they used to be in the UK. They are still found in South Africa. They're still found in lots of places around the world. They're still found in straw if you keep chickens or you keep pigs. So it's that working together. It's looking outside the box. It's looking outside the national hive box and thinking, right, what can we do now that's really good for bees and really going to help them survive? And I really believe the core of all this is that the bees are dying because of our environment, because of what we've done to our environment. And we are sharing that environment with the bees. So if we are killing the bees, what impact is our environment having on us and our own health? And this is why I believe that the bees are really calling to us. They're calling to our souls, to our hearts, to say, listen to us, watch, help us. and it's because the bees want to help us. And so saving the bees is really saving humanity as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and I hope it's given you lots of information. And those of you who are going to be joining me on the course, I really look forward to joining you on your beekeeping journey and helping get you really set up so that you really have all the tools and all the information you need to be a really strong, confident naturopathic beekeeper. So we are open until the 2nd of Feb, I think, 2nd or 3rd of Feb. And then after that, you won't be able to join the course. So we just have this one class so that we're all going through it together through February. There will be recordings. And once you've joined, even if you can't make the recordings, you can catch them up and watch them in your own time. But it's really important that we work through this together so that I know you've completed the course and that you can then get your certificate. And if anyone says you don't know what you're doing, you can show the certificate and say, yes, I do. I am a confident and happy naturopathic beekeeper with happy and healthy bees. So good night.